In the 90s, Hollywood was crunching out masterpieces like it was nothing. It is completely unimaginable to the modern moviegoer how something like the 90s could have ever happened. In the 90s, even the movies that weren't masterpieces happened to be some of the most memorable movies to date. If you had to choose one movie from the 90s above all others, it would be a scientific impossibility, for it was the decade when they made some of the best movies of all times multiple times a year. It was the decade when many of the greatest directors were still doing some of their best stuff, and yet you had so many new directors who hit the scene and started going. People who we today have come to consider as some of the greatest of all time. There is no other decade like it. In the 90s, we got the best of the both worlds. It was also one of the last decades when real movie stars still existed. Once again, many of the old were still in their prime, and you had newer actors who in the 90s became the greatest. If you are too young to have lived through the 90s, let this video be your guidebook into all of those movies that you need to see or for the ones you may have missed. If you are like me, a guy who spent his childhood and teenage years in the 90s, I salute you. Living in that era, we simply didn't know how good we had it. Now, the decade started with some of the most memorable movies of the 90s, namely Edward Scissorhands, Home Alone, and Die Hard 2. For anyone who lived back then, Home Alone is probably one of the most beloved whole family movies of all time, and for any action fanatic, Bruce Willis's Die Hard 2 remains one of the classics. We got Godfather Part 3, which was a letdown. Back to the Future Part 3 came out. We got one of the most legendary romance movies of all time, Pretty Woman, where Richard Gere falls in love with a whore played by Julia Roberts. And that being said, 1990 was also the year when Paul Verhoeven, who is one of the most underrated directors of all time, was still clearly doing it. For he made Total Recall, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, a must-see sci-fi adventure where a muscular working-class man realizes his life has been a scam and has to fly to Mars to save all humanity. 1990s was also the era when Kevin Costner was in the limelight, starting with his probably most well-known and best movie, Dances with Wolves, which is a long and an insanely deep and heavy drama about America back in the day with Indians and Shiites. Kevin Costner was a big name and made many movies in this decade, but this was his masterpiece. There is, however, one movie that stands above all else in the year 1990. A movie that brings the likes of Martin Scorsese to the decade, almost as a small reminder of just like, yeah, these were the kind of things that were just happening. It was the year when Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas came out, which is one of the best gangster movies of all time and an absolute Scorsese classic. Ray Liotta, who never really made much other good movies, gave one of the best leading performances ever as the young guy who wanted to become a gangster and got what he wanted. Now, of course, De Niro and Joe Pesci were in the movie as well. This was still in the golden years of when the Scorsese band was together. We also got Jacob's Ladder, an absolute masterpiece and a classic. A story about a Vietnam War veteran which, in its final conclusion, manages to reveal something more about our relationship with death than any anthropologist ever could. Getting into 91, we had such classics as The Fisher King, Boys and the Hoods, and the animated original Beauty and the Beasts. Point Break, arguably the best movie Kathryn Bigelow ever made, a movie that is still remembered as one of the great action movies that a woman made, which the modern woke audience seems to have forgotten entirely, starring Keanu Reeves in his early career and Patrick Swayze. We got Thelma and Louise, which is a Ridley Scott movie about two women who decide to just fuck it and go their own way, which in my view, in its final conclusion, becomes a masterpiece and a true work of art. Also one of the movies which the woke community seems to have forgotten. Silence of the Lambs came out 91, an absolute masterpiece, which to this day is one of the best thrillers of all time with a performance from Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal, the serial killer that rivals that of Heath Ledger's Joker in how iconic it is, and Jodie Foster nailing it as the detective. Now, the 90s, in my view, was kind of like the decade where Arnold Schwarzenegger's career came to die. But he went out with a bang, giving us some of his best movies in the first years of the decades. He was the action hero of the 80s, but coming into the 90s, he was still on a roll. In 91, we got arguably the best movie he would ever make, namely Terminator 2. This was the last masterpiece he would make. In 92, we got such memorable movies as Scent of a Woman, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Last of Mohicans, but also the last of the Michael Keaton's and Tim Burton's Batmans, namely Batman Returns. This movie was such a hit and lives up to the hype to this day that anyone who hasn't seen Tim Burton's two Batman movies should go and watch them. We got by the now a cult classic Army of Darkness from Sam Raimi, and one of the first movies about hackers called Sneakers. This was still a time when people didn't own computers. Sneakers is a really heartfelt movie about social engineering, freaking, and hacking. We got the animated movie Aladdin, which all kids loved. But the two masterpieces of this year was the Western Unforgiven, which is one of the greatest Westerns ever made, although a different take on the matter, which I personally loved. It is the actor Clint Eastwood's swan song to the Westerns, and in many ways to the Westerns as a whole. It's a movie that is almost like a contemplation on the nature of Westerns themselves, and it is as profound as it sounds. And then something happens, which made you wonder. Reservoir Dogs. The movie where a band of hired criminals are busting each other's balls in a warehouse for the whole movie, and it is the greatest. This was the year when Quentin Tarantino blew everyone out of the waters with his debut movie, making him the first of the new greats to enter the scene in the 90s. 93, we got such classic movies like The Groundhog Day from Bill Murray or Gilbert Grape, which was the movie where Leonardo DiCaprio entered cinema with arguably his best performance to date. Linklater made one of his first movies with Dazed and Confused. Quentin Tarantino offhand wrote a script for the movie True Romance, which remains brilliant to this day. It's a very Tarantino movie, even if he didn't direct it himself. Denzel Washington in the 90s was the most talented actor whose movies seemed always a bit lackluster compared to his acting chops. He never quite found his masterpiece, but he did make Philadelphia with Tom Hanks, a deep gay drama about HIV, which is unquestionably a good movie. There were two real masterpieces that year. This was the decade when Spielberg was doing some of his best stuff, and 93 was the year when he made Schindler's Lists. The most profound drama about Nazi times that everyone must see as a basic education in life. But there was another movie which anybody who lived through that time remembers. Back in the 90s, movies used to be a phenomenon. If there was a big movie, everyone went to see it and everybody talked about it. 93 was when one of the biggest spectacles of the decade happened, which was Jurassic Park. Another Steven Spielberg classic. I mean, the guy made two masterpieces in 1 year, but that's Spielberg for you. Jurassic Park to this day lives up to the hype when it comes to its special effects, but at the time it was one of the most terrifying experiences and at the same time so much larger than life that in some ways it perfectly captures the feeling of the early 90s. It's a movie where they bring dinosaurs back to life from DNA, and you can imagine what happens next. It is simply one of the most epic movies ever made. 94 was one of the most insane years in the history of cinema. In 94, we got movies like Schwarzenegger's True Lies, which was still pretty good but didn't live up to his earlier classics. Little Women and Maverick came out. Jim Carrey hit the scene with three movies, Dumb and Dumber, Mask, and Ace Ventura, all of which in the 90s became legendary Jim Carrey comedies in their own right. While the style of Jim Carrey's comedy might not do it for everyone, in the 90s his movies were the most successful comedies and he was a household name. Interview with the Vampire, which is my personal secret guilty pleasure starring Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. I mean, the idea that you would take two of the best looking actors of all time in their prime and put them into the same movie playing the coolest guys ever. Although I think it's actually one of the deepest movies ever made. Every scene is shot like a painting. I'm not sure if any other movie got the Victorian era brought to life as visually as this movie, especially when the clothes are being worn by these guys. The fact that Kirsten Dunst as a kid could work at the level of these two greats, delivering one of the best child performances. It also demonstrates the range Tom Cruise had as an actor. I believe this to be the performance of his career. The movie touches on something universal with its contemplation on the pain of eternal life that I always wonder why nobody considers it a masterpiece. It's one of the movies where my personal opinion about the movie is in contradiction with the rest of the population. Whatever you want to say about this movie, nobody can disagree with the fact that this is the one vampire movie where they got vampires right. In 94, we got Stargate, Natural Born Killers, which is one of the last good Oliver Stone movies. We got Once Warriors. We got by the now a cult classic, The Crow. Jackie Chan did Drunken Master 2. Now for the true masterpieces of 94. Kevin Smith hit the scene with his debut movie Clerks. Younger people who see Kevin Smith today may not know how he became such a figure in the movie industry. He's one of those guys who's just part of the whole fan scene of movies and comic books. He quickly spiraled into obscurity as a director after the 90s. But in 94, he became a big name with his movie. Clerks is a movie about a clerk in a small store, and the whole movie is about him just having conversations with people. It is at the same time one of the most clever art house movies ever made, and also one of the most quick-witted and societally important independent movies ever made. It's much akin to the stuff Richard Linklater is known for, but with a more sarcastic and cynical edge. A must-watch for any film freak. Natalie Portman's debut movie, Leon, in which she did one of the greatest child performances in history, which is also probably one of those movies that nobody remembers. Leon is an unquestionable masterpiece of a movie starring Jean Reno, one of the greatest French actors of all time, doing his English-speaking movie and nailing it. Leon is a movie you need to see if you haven't seen it. It might just be the best movie about an assassin ever made, and it is super deep and heavy, and not what you would expect, but in a good way. 94 was also when Shawshank's Redemption came out. I can't count the times I have checked the IMDb 250 list and seen this movie ranked as the greatest movie of all time. I don't think it's the greatest. It is probably simply the only movie that nobody hates. But it is still very much an unquestionable masterpiece of the ages. Easily one of the best feel-good movies of all time. You just cannot not love this movie, and by the way, it was written by none other than Stephen King. 94 was also the year when Forrest Gump came out. Another era-defining masterpiece, and as a feel-good movie rivaling that of The Shawshank's Redemption. And also one of the most iconic movies that perfectly captures the feel of the early 90s. It's a movie where Tom Hanks is playing a retard that ends up accidentally demonstrating to everyone how with determination one can overcome their obstacles. Now, if these movies were not enough, we still got one coming. Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction. Yeah, guys, this was the moment when you started realizing that there was something going on with cinema. This was truly the moment when the 90s had arrived and were in full swing. If Tarantino's debut in Reservoir Dogs had raised him to the limelight, it was Pulp Fiction that cemented his existence in the history of cinema as one of the greatest of all time. It was a crime drama that brought Travolta back to life, proved Bruce Willis as the awesome actor who appeared in all the best stuff in the 90s, demonstrated how cool Samuel Jackson could be, and had Uma Thurman nail the fucking shit out of that movie. It is probably the most Tarantino movie from Tarantino to date, and it was pure fucking brilliance. It is impossible to overstate the level of impact it had at the time culturally and how much everybody loved the movie. Oh yeah, and we got Lion King that year as well. Now, getting into 95, we got movies like Toy Story, which was a big kids phenomena. We got Desperado, where Antonio Banderas hit the scene with Salma Hayek, and Bad Boys, where Will Smith entered the movies. Will Smith did many memorable movies in the 90s and was a big name, but none of his movies were the greatest. Sylvester Stallone did Judge Dredd, which was one of the million random action movies he made in the 90s. Just like Schwarzenegger, he had done his best stuff in the earlier decades. Which brings to mind Steven Seagal, who did Under Siege 2, which many B-class action movie lovers love to this day. We got Leonardo DiCaprio in my personal favorite DiCaprio movie of all time, in The Basketball Diaries, which in my view is an underrated masterpiece about the life of a junkie. Another Tom Hanks movie, Apollo 13, came out, which at the time was considered brilliant. In 95, Richard Linklater simply went and made his masterpiece, Before Sunrise. which is so close to real life that it is hard to understand how somebody could make such a movie, starring Ethan Hawke, who was also doing it in the 90s. It is a must-watch for any film freak wanting to sharpen their nails with something that requires a soul and an intellect to be appreciated. It is a movie about two strangers who meet in the train and spend one night together walking and talking. But then something happens, and an animated movie hit the scene called Ghost in the Shell. This was probably the first movie ever made which depicted technology and computers in a way that made you think about networks. Such things had only been written about so far in the likes of Gibson's Neuromancer, but Ghost in the Shell brought the future on screen. An instant cyberpunk classic that opened your mind to the possibility of technology in new ways. You have to understand that people in this year still did not have computers or the internet. So people didn't have an idea about the ramifications of such things. Usual Suspects came out, which was kind of like the first twist-ending movie that in the 2000s would become a thing. The one movie nobody remembers that everyone should see is the Terry Gilliam sci-fi movie 12 Monkeys, starring once again Bruce Willis and Brad Pitt. This is by far one of the greatest sci-fis ever made and definitely the greatest time travel movie ever made. Par none. Watch it, you won't regret it. But the real masterpiece of that year, Braveheart, Mel Gibson's debut as director, which in my view is probably the greatest sword movie of all time. People like to remember Gladiator, but I'm telling you right now, if you haven't seen Braveheart, you have missed a portion of your life. It is the deepest tough guys with swords movie ever made, beating even that of Gladiator. In Braveheart, we get the most iconic talk before battle speeches in movie history. If you ever wanted to fight for justice or defend your homelands, all you would have to do would be to watch Braveheart, and you would be willing to sacrifice your life after that with no questions asked. If this movie does not move you as a man, then you should be banished from these lands. Another masterpiece and a classic that people like to quote today, the movie Heat. Michael Mann's magnum opus, where Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, who were still in their prime, just happened to get into the same movie, and it just happened to be one of the greatest and once again heaviest drama heist movies of all time. This was just the stuff of the 90s. Entire videos have been made of this movie alone. And that being said, although people today consider this movie a massive thing, at the time when it came out, it wasn't a big phenomenon or anything. It was simply a movie that everyone thought to be a solid deep action movie. I consider it to be kind of like the last great movie De Niro and Pacino would make. Although De Niro did make another masterpiece that year as well. Scorsese came out and made one more gangster masterpiece in The Casino, starring once again Robert De Niro with Sharon Stone hitting the scene with a powerful performance. Pesci was awesome as always. This was probably De Niro's and Scorsese's last masterpiece, at the very least when it came to the 90s. After this, De Niro started making random movies. To top the year off with another masterpiece, in 95 we got Seven, the movie where David Fincher started going. Starring Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman, and Kevin Spacey, which were all doing the very best stuff in the 90s. It's a chilling thriller about the hunt for a serial killer and one of the best in its genre. This was the year when you could feel something starting to change. Maybe it was the nihilistic nature of Seven or the technological realizations of Ghost in the Shell, but somehow the naive optimism and lightheartedness of the early 90s had started to shift into something more pessimistic and clinical. 96 was probably the worst year in cinema for the 90s, but it also gave us some of the most memorable movies and events of the decades. In movies like Scream, the first and best Mission Impossible, Jerry Maguire, and Independence Day, which in no way is a good movie, but at the time was a massive phenomena having Will Smith do his thing. The one movie which most people miss and don't know about is the movie that the Wachowski brothers made as a debut, when being rejected by the studio for their ambitions, which were too big. The studio told these guys that they had to prove themselves first, so they made Bounds. It is a brilliantly crafted crime movie, some of the most intense movies you will ever see, and a must-watch for anyone who missed it. It is one of the movies of the decade that most of people don't know about. My personal favorite, which I believe to be a masterpiece of the ages, Trainspotting, came out that year. It is a British movie about the life of junkies, Filled with British chunky humor, it is probably the best movie ever made about the death of one's inner child. The only movie that year that people tend to consider a masterpiece is Fargo, which is an intelligent crime drama where people have dumb accents. Yeah, the Coen brothers were also doing it in the 90s. In 97, we got movies like Rainmaker, Contact, Austin Powers, Face Off, where Travolta and Nicolas Cage faced off, Starship Troopers from Paul Verhoeven, which is an underrated classic any sci-fi fan must see, Fifth Element, which was a phenomena and to this day a fun adventure movie and a good example of how Bruce Willis was just the stuff of the 90s. LA Confidential was a solid movie. Travolta made Jackie Brown, which to many was a bit of a letdown. But in 97, we got another movie which many people may have missed, which is an absolute masterpiece, Gattaca, starring Ethan Hawke, Uma Thurman, and Jude Law. It is a deeply philosophical and tragically inspiring sci-fi movie about the right of every man to make something out of themselves that everyone needs to see. Another movie most people don't remember is Cube, which is one of the most inventive and intensive sci-fi movies ever made. The concept is so original and the execution of the storyline fits it perfectly. This is small budget sci-fi done right. 97 gave us the unquestionable masterpiece Good Will Hunting, where Matt Damon and Ben Affleck hit the scene winning the Oscars with it. They were so the stuff of the 90s, and it is their best movie to date. It's a heavy drama about a gifted guy who's trying to find their path in life. In 97, my personal favorite anime of all time came out, Princess Mononoke. It is a deep and a philosophical movie with plenty of cool action and brilliant animation about man's willingness to degrade nature and its ramifications. A must-see. That being said, 97 was the year when another phenomena of the decade happened, Titanic. Like I said, Leonardo DiCaprio was on a roll. Titanic is remembered as a lame sob movie. I was so embarrassed as a 13-year-old boy who went to see the movie 7 times. To this day, I feel ashamed for having done that, but it was more common than what people are willing to admit. I think the movie receives unreasonable criticism because of the DiCaprio sob story elements, but yeah, let's just note that it happened. Now, the real masterpiece of the year was a movie nobody ever talks about, coming from one of the greatest directors of all time that nobody talks about. Hitting us with the movie that should be considered as his debut, Boogie Nights. I swear to God, this movie is a drama masterpiece, which is, in my view, Paul Thomas Anderson's best movie to date. Starring Mark Wahlberg in the best acting performance of his career and in the best movie of his career. This movie should be a classic, and anyone who hasn't seen it should watch it. It is the movie where one of the greatest actors of all time, Philip Seymour Hoffman, hit the scene in a side role that made you notice the guy's acting chops. It is a period piece set in the porn industry at the time when they were going from the big screen to videotapes. 98, we got movies like Rushmore, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, classic Johnny Depp with an ounce of Hunter S. Thompson, Dark City, The Poor Man's Matrix, Pi, Darren Aronofsky's debut, Blade, anybody? Christopher Nolan's debut, The Following, Rounders, the Matt Damon, Edward Norton movie about poker, which might just be the best poker movie ever made. These were the kinds of movies that just randomly came out in the 90s in massive quantities every year. Truman Show came out, which is probably Jim Carrey's best movie ever after Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, of course. But the year also gave us some serious masterpieces. Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels came out, and with it, the director Guy Ritchie hit the scene. It's a crafty and most sarcastic British crime drama. Big Lebowski, which is probably the masterpiece from the Coen brothers everyone remembers before No Country for Old Men. It tells the story of a guy called The Dudes. American History X, a deep drama starring Edward Norton as a Nazi and Edward Furlong, the kid from Terminator 2 that you always saw in the 90s. It is a true masterpiece of a drama about racism that everyone should see. Steven Spielberg made Saving Private Ryan, which was probably his last true masterpiece. It's also another masterpiece starring Matt Damon and Tom Hanks from the 90s. By the end of the decade, these guys had done so much for cinema that they should be given a special award for that shit. Now, the one thing this year that I want to mention specifically is the war movie, which I consider to be the greatest war movie of all time, next to Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. Everyone remembers Spielberg Saving Private Ryan. I remember something else. This movie is one of the hidden gems of the 90s. It is the deepest, most philosophical, and most contemplative war movies ever made, which has a completely insane cast, starring like 10 different A-listers. The Thin Red Line. One of the last movies where the director Terrence Malick was still being kind of normal. The movie where Terrence Malick pissed off the producers just to leave his dent in the universe of cinema. I personally consider it his magnum opus and a true masterpiece of the ages. It takes a bold, somewhat artistic angle to the experience of war, contemplating on the losing of one's sensitivity in the middle of violence. Such a statement about our inner childs have never been made. With a soundtrack that has such music like The Journey to the Line, or the one where the Primordial Kids sing a song called God You Tekem Life Belong Me, composed by none other than Hans Zimmer himself. It hits your emotions like no movie ever has, a must-see for any person with a soul. Coming to the last year of the decade, we got movies like American Pie, which became a legendary comedy. Mummy came out, which is a fun adventure flick to this day. Girl Interrupted. Dogma, where the director Kevin Smith was still kind of doing it. Being John Malkovich. Boondock Saints. Kubrick made his last movie in Eyes Wide Shut. Had the studio not cut off 20 minutes of the movie after his death, it would have probably been a masterpiece of the ages, but I guess we will never find out. Sixth Sense came out, which truly got the twist ending craze started. Paul Thomas Anderson made another masterpiece in Magnolia. American Beauty and Green Mile came out, both of which many consider masterpieces. Oh yeah, and another movie came out. Fight Club. Starring Brad Pitt in his absolute prime, playing the coolest guy in history, doing one of his best performances to date, alongside once again Edward Norton, who both ended the decade having done some of the best stuff. Fight Club became an instant cult classic. It is one of the most existential movies of all time, telling the story of a really boring and pathetic individual who meets the coolest guy ever, who also happens to be one of the greatest philosophers you would ever meet. Then they end up punching each other in the face, just to feel alive. If you ever wanted to scientifically demonstrate to someone what a cool guy is and what woman would be drooling over, it would be Tyler Durden from Fight Club. The thing is that one could make a separate video about most of the movies mentioned in this video. It hurts my soul to have to mention so many of the most epic movies in history in a side sentence. But if you truly sat down to describe every movie in detail, this would be a 10 hours long video. Think about that. Think about the 90s. Think about all of these movies that came out, masterpiece after masterpiece. Name me one other decade in cinema where Hollywood was pumping out 2 to 5 masterpieces a year, not even counting the rest of the awesome movies. But there is still one movie to come. One movie that ended the decade in a way that solidifies it as the greatest decade in cinema. The Matrix. Wow. I mean, come on guys, you knew it was coming. What a way to end a decade. The Matrix wasn't just the best movie of all time. It wasn't just a movie that would define cinema forever. It was a cultural phenomenon. It was the movie that brought the society to the information age, to the age of computers. It was the movie that made you question the authority and got you to think with your own brains. It was the coolest movie ever made. It had the best action. It was the most aesthetic experience. It had the most effective script ever written. It was the most philosophical story, and it was the most culture-impacting movie ever made. The digital age literally started with The Matrix. I don't think that a movie like The Matrix will ever be made again. It stands out even among the greatest as something special. They nailed so many aspects of making a movie in this one fucking movie that it is insane to think that such a movie could have ever been made. It is one mind-blowing experience that I believe will stand the test of time, not for decades, but for centuries to come. I believe it to be the movie that people will watch 500 years from now. Just like we look at the paintings of Da Vinci today or listen to the classical composers. The Matrix gave us some of the most memorable and iconic characters of the decades. Keanu Reeves as Neo, the slightly Asperger nerds that is purely logical. Carrie-Anne Moss, the no-bullshit lady who is willing to fight and is super competent. Lawrence Fishburne as Morpheus, which is literally competing with the likes of Gandalf or the Darth Vader in how many people on this planet know his name and know what he's about. Hugo Weaving giving the most deliberately robotic performance in history. Joey Pantoliano, the villain everyone relates to. He may have not been as iconic, but his performance as the guy who just wants to feel good for once in his life is unquestionably one of the greatest. The Matrix is a movie about a hacker who finds out there is something wrong with reality. I remember going to the cinema over 10 times to watch Fight Club and The Matrix over and over again, beating even that of Titanic. By the age of 40, I have now watched The Matrix probably around 40 times. In the 90s, movies were like magic. There was a mood in the air that you could feel. Going to the movies was an experience. Back then, people still went to the theaters, and when you were waiting to enter, you couldn't be on your phone logged out of existence. No, you were there and you could sense the anticipation building up. There was also no streaming services. You had to walk or ride your bike to the video store. The likes where Tarantino used to work in and check movies based on their covers. I was one of the first people on the IMDb in the 90s before anybody else even owned a computer. And it was my treasure chests. But as a young kid before that, I literally picked videos based on their covers, and there was something mystical about it. I still remember seeing Pulp Fiction just appear on the shelf and knowing that this would be something insane. Then driving home, putting the cassette in, and having the experience of a lifetime. Which was the best decade in cinema? Some make the claim for the 70s or the 80s, and it has to be admitted, those were some of the best years in the history of movies. I grew up watching movies from those eras. Some people even make the claim for the 50s or the 60s, but I don't think those decades can match the sheer volume of masterpieces of the later decades. 2000s was also still quite awesome, and I'm sure for many the greatest. We had so many memorable masterpiece classics that decades. By the time that we were entering the 2010s, it felt like cinema was still in swing. But everything simply slowed down from there. Until now. How many masterpieces of a movie have you seen in recent years? In the modern climate, we are lucky to get one a year. But truly memorable masterpieces? One could ask if they even make such things anymore. Look at these movies. I mean, sure, there are some outright masterpieces out there and even some memorable cult classics. But is this list comparable to the movies we just went through? Check this out. How the fuck did they make such an insane quantity of the best movies in the 90s? When I look at these lists, it brings tears to my eyes. It is rare in the history of mankind for humanity to express themselves like we did in the 90s. The 90s cinema is a proof that we as people have a soul. If the aliens would arrive on this planet and ask me if we have an appreciation for something more meaningful, I would show them these lists and sit them in front of the screen for weeks on end. I would sit next to them and we would cry together, marveling the depths of where these stories take you. The question of which was the best decade is debatable, but me personally, I think it was the 90s. In that decade, something magical happened. There was no woke agenda behind anything, and the studios didn't seem to breathe so hard on everyone's ass. Just like still in the 2000s, before the streaming services took over, medium-budget movies were still feasible to make and many times got wide releases. Many of the greatest directors and actors of all time were either doing their best shit or making an entrance to the scene never seen before. In the 90s cinema, so many planets got aligned. Creativity was let to run free. There was no cultural pressure for anything. Expression was not prevented from happening, and all of the greatest artists gathered together. And they gave us something that will never be seen again. I swear to God, the 90s is what people will be watching hundreds of years from now, along with the 2000s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and the 80s, as the time of the movie. In the same way we look at the Mona Lisa today or listen to Beethoven, which do you think was the best decade in cinema?